This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Well, welcome back everybody to Tools of the Trade. We're going to be talking about engraving tools today, and specifically hand engraving and non-powered engraving. So we're going to be talking about tools that are either hammered or hand pushed, and that's a little bit different than what we would have in the tiny tools that are going to be fitted into the hammer hand pieces like you see from GRS and from Steve Lindsay, where the hammering work is controlled by a small air compressor built in that allows you to move the work, and it does all the hammering for you, versus some of these larger chisels where you might be doing a little bit more steel work where you're taking a hammer and you're driving it, and that's exactly how you're moving your material that way. When we're working with a smaller, what's more of a, what you think of as a traditional graver like this, or engraving tool, you're pushing with your hand. So it's meant to sit in your palm, and that allows you to get some pressure, and you can hold it however is comfortable for what you're doing, but that allows you to reach in and cut the material away, which is much of what engraving is. You're not chasing the material and pushing it around. We're cutting it off actually to create our depth. But before we get into all of this, let's hear from our sponsor.
Before we take on any new project, we make sure to have the right tools to get the job done. We take the same approach when it comes to our mental health, which is why we're sponsored by BetterHelp, an online platform offering tools to make starting therapy easier. Did you know that therapy isn't just for people with clinical mental health issues like depression or anxiety? Therapy can offer much more, like a safe, judgment-free space to share what's on your mind. It can also offer tools and healthier habits for personal growth and problem solving. You know I'm always looking for more tools. Regardless of what you're looking for, you'll receive help from a trained mental health professional who'll listen, ask questions, and will help you see things from new perspectives. To get started, simply complete the BetterHelp questionnaire, and usually within a few days you'll be matched with a therapist. So if you think you'll benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/BKS and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Click on the link to get started today with BetterHelp.
So one of the things that you think of when you see larger work, much like we've shown you that Ilya was doing, carving some of the blades themselves, or if you're doing big tool and die work where you're removing a lot of metal before you create the form, you're going to be working with some of these larger chisels. The advantage of these larger chisels is you can get your hands on them, that's one thing, and you can get behind them with a hammer like this and you're driving that chisel and you're cutting material away. You've got to get the material out of your way before you begin to create the artwork. And that's what a lot of this bigger stuff is for. These are typically either worked into the engraving blocks like we talked about, where they don't really pivot for you, or into something that's just simply held in a vise or nailed to a board even that might just be on a table, where you can really get into it and chip the pieces of material away. Not unlike chip carving that you would do with wood. It's very similar to that. Some of the history of the engraving tools that you see here, they're going to come from shops where you may have big piles of things like this, where every job you've got a handful of these and you just grind them to whatever shape you want. So if you're getting into something or you're trying to make a change that's minute and you want it to be very specific, you'll grind a tool for that, and that's why we have so many of the different tools. These are almost like a consumable, so these just lift out like that. They're just ground out. You can stick them right back into the handle. You're only pushing in one direction. You're putting it up into your palm, you're holding that with your fingertips, and you're pushing in one direction, so you don't have to worry about it really coming out like that. And a lot of tools are just like this. They're made so that they just come right out, and you grind them down. If you're buying a new one, they're about this size. This is pretty typical for what you would find in a graver. And then the handles are separate, and they're in many different forms. This is kind of an older form. I like this style, although sometimes I will grind one side flat so it'll sit into the palm, and we have a few examples of that. This is a brand new one in mahogany. You can also get them in teak or different woods. And you just change out the cutters as you need them, or you buy a whole bunch of them and you put them together, and then, you know, you can kind of keep them laid out the way that you want. But nobody should think of them necessarily as a specific precious thing that's meant to last a long time, unlike these big gravers that are really set up in such a way that they're a lifetime tool. They're probably a multiple lifetime tool where they're going to pass down from hands to hands. And that's the kind of thing that differentiates with this. We're going to keep grinding these to keep them sharp on a regular basis, and they're going to get smaller and smaller, and then you can buy the exact same original piece, put it back in there. Many people don't actually work with a graver this long. From brand new, they'll just cut this off. They might cut it in half, and that's how you end up with all these real small ones, because they're trying to work very close to the hand. The exception to the rule of that kind of being, like I said, maybe somewhat disposable would be ones that you see either with collets or with these sliders, where it'll take a piece of hardened tool steel and you've got this collar that slides up and locks it in place, and that, you know, you have something that's going to last a while. These were typically sold in sets. Most of the ones that I've seen are late in the 1800s, and there might be a set of 6 of them. They just kind of randomly occur these days, and if you are talking to an engraver or seeing things that you're purchasing from an estate, there might be a couple of them. You know, I've only ever seen one complete set, but they certainly exist. A lot of these I find made in Pennsylvania, and then the actual pieces of tool steel tend to come from places like Switzerland, places that were, you know, mass producing engraving tools. But it's kind of an interesting thing because it fits into this handle repeatedly, and you would sharpen it until it didn't really fit right, and then you discard that. So I've got a handful of those, and then when you get a little bit later, you start seeing some of the tools set into collets. So you've got almost like a little round vise here, like you would have on a tiny drill or something like that, and that'll hold different things. This actually has a beating tool in it, so this what we call a mill graining tool. It's got a little tiny wheel that's sharp, and instead of making a single cut, you're able to make a series of small cuts by using the wheels that are mounted in the end of here. You have to keep these fairly clean. The wheels are tiny, so your pressure has to be very even, and it can't be so much that you break the spindle. So typically when we're using these, we'll put a little drip of oil on them, and then we'll go in and make that cut, and that'll lubricate it just enough to do it. When I'm doing mill graining, I tend to work on the peak of something where I've cut one side and then cut the other side away, and we have a peak, and you just go right across the peak of that, and it will make very even, very bright cuts across the top. All of these have specific purposes in the styles in which they are cut. The pieces that I ground and polished when I was working with Tom Herman, we were carving gold. One of the things that we needed to be able to do was to cut to one side of the inside of a channel. So we would create a channel in the outside of that ring that we would do actually with a saw. It's not a difficult way to do it. You can go around a ring with a saw blade. The saw blade will arc slightly, and it'll cut around through the piece. And then to get that back to a brighter cut like you would see on the face of a graver, you would, this one, as you can take a look, this is ground to one side. That gives you a leading edge and a trailing edge. The leading edge is sharp. The trailing edge essentially doesn't really cut material because it has the wrong angle. So that allows you to go down into that groove and only cut on one side, giving you a lot of control. By having that cut bright, which is ground, typically I would grind things maybe as high as 4,000 grit on a diamond stone. That would impart that brightness into your cut. So you would go from something that would be a saw cut, which is kind of rough, that might absorb light, to something that reflects light by using a bright cut on the end of a graver. So you'll find these gravers, when these come, they're just square on the faces, and then you would lay in the angles that you need and then make a decision what that cutter is going to be, grind that in, and then polish it. There are lots of ways to do that, and we'll go into sharpening at some point where we have both a sharpening stone and some way to control that graver. Now there are guys still today who have done enough of it that they can just simply freehand that. But we also have some very precise things that will hold exacting angles and grind exacting angles. And that does tend to do a better job with bright cutting, although an extremely skilled person can do it by eye. almost everything you see is straight or has a slight angle at the tang where it attaches to the handle. An exception to that rule is something that's really extreme like this. The reason that you see this tool is that it allows you to get inside of an object. Typically, with what we deal with, you would be cutting on the inside of a ring, and that would allow you to do engraving work right on the inside of the ring if you were putting initials or a date, a wedding date, or something like that. A slightly unusual variant of that, if we take a look at this one, these liners look like that in general, and they would remove material, but what they actually do, if you can see, there's multiple lines across here, and that will allow you to cut textures on the surface. So instead of trying to take a cutter a single line and making a cut across something, this would give you a series of lines. You could also cut that series and then move it over and cut another series. But one of the things that's most common that we think of is what we call Florentining, where you're essentially making a crosshatch with something like this, much like you would do into wood if you were checkering on a stock, but more minutely, and that's going to give you a different type of shading on the surface of the work. Very different than if you're trying to produce a polish or a burnished finish. So in closing, thanks for coming to see basically, a kind of a simplistic view of what hand engravers are, because it's going to take quite a bit. We're going to deep dive into each different style and show you how they work and how they get sharpened. So look forward to coming back to the channel for that, and we'll continue to show you some basic outlines of some of the tools that we use here at Baltimore Knife. Click the logo to subscribe, or click one of the videos to see more here on the Baltimore Knife and Sword channel, or go to Almy and watch Man at Arms.